So the UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab actually mentioned about this reform is actually a breach of the joint declaration. What's your views on that?
It's not the first time that the Foreign Secretary alleged breach of the joint declaration. Also, it's not the first time that he didn't offer any substance as to where and how the joint declaration was breached by the Chinese government. And it's actually a surprise to me that quality papers such as the Financial Times, which carried a rather prominent report on this allegation, did not actually follow up with the Foreign Secretary as to where and how the joint declaration was breached. I think our audience should take the trouble of looking up the joint declaration. The joint declaration in the main text only refers to the election of the chief executive. And it goes something like this. The chief executive shall be appointed by the Central People's Government on the basis of elections or consultations held locally. So it's either elections or consultations. And if the British side somehow believes that the election of the chief executive by electoral college election is a breach of joint declaration, how about consultation? Now, in the elaboration on the basic principles of policies by the Chinese government in Annex 1 to the joint declaration, the Chinese side actually mentioned that the Legislative Council will be constituted by elections, but didn't say which form or kind of election.
As in how, right?
And mind you, in 1984, there was no election to the Legislative Council in Hong Kong at all. Forget about election committee election. There was no election at all. All members of the Legislative Council were appointed by the British governor, who in turn was appointed without consultation, without election in Hong Kong, by the British government. And it was only a year after the joint declaration had been signed, namely 1985, that the British Hong Kong government in Hong Kong launched the first ever election to the Legislative Council by not one man, one vote, by functional constituency election. Now, in the electoral reform decision of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, that we're talking about an enlarged election committee election. And the election committee had been responsible for electing the chief executive, which is a very important and powerful position. So what are we talking about? So please, Foreign Secretary, tell us.
Freedom has been quite frequently used by them to attack the Chinese government and the Hong Kong administration. What's your views on that?
These are just empty labels. Well, to whom are we comparing? Are we comparing ourselves to the Hong Kong under British rule? You are too young to remember. I was around. What were the degrees of freedom, political freedoms, freedoms of speech, freedoms of assembly that we had in Hong Kong before 1997? There was a special branch in Hong Kong within the police force to make sure that our freedoms did not run amok as far as the British government was concerned. There was a place in the western part of Hong Kong Island, which is now, funnily enough, the campus of the Chicago Booth Business School, that's known to locals as the White Building, Ba Hok, that was used as a detention center to detain political prisoners, mainland Chinese, Taiwanese, Russians, without trial. The person wouldn't even have access to the judiciary in Hong Kong. So what freedoms are we talking about? The British government in Hong Kong actually closed down media organizations, newspapers in Hong Kong in the 1960s. What freedoms are we talking about? So I think our viewers should compare whatever they hear about Hong Kong, whatever they think about Hong Kong, they should compare Hong Kong to Hong Kong in the past, and at the present, compare Hong Kong to other jurisdictions, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, etc., so that we have a three-dimensional view of what we are having in Hong Kong.